Thank you, Mike, and good to be here this evening. we're, we're officially gone from afternoon to evening, I think. So what I'm doing is following up some of the conversation that we've had earlier, and I think this presentation fits in really well with what we've heard earlier. So, no, clearly what we've heard is a focus on PGR use for harvest management. But of course, I'm the post-harvest guy, and I'm always concerned about how we use this information, or how we use these technologies, and how they influence post-harvest. So, as Terence mentioned, PGRs slow down maturation, or the progression of maturation, but they do not uniformly stop each biological process. So they're powerful tools, but they're not magic bullets. And so one concern that I always have as the post-harvest guy is that there's sometimes a feeling in the minds of growers that if I put on Retain or if I put on Harvista, I can leave that fruit and that's just going to be exactly the way that they should have been or would have been if I harvested them at what we regard as the optimum time. So we know that residual effects on maintaining quality factors such as firmness can be significant, and I'll reinforce that with a couple of data slides in a moment, but they can be lost with later harvests. The effect of these PGRs on storage disorders can be positive and or negative. But obviously, because you wouldn't be using PGRs, none of the negative effects are reasons for not using them. But I think the take-home message that you're going to get from me today is that absolutely you should be using PGRs, but you need to be aware of and adjust the handling practices. So I'm going to use a few examples today on McIntosh, Gala, and Honeycrisp as examples. I'm going to start off with McIntosh, and just here's a fairly typical type of response. And you've heard this sort of spoken about already. This is McIntosh 4-month CA storage plus 7 days. So they've had a shelf life, which is a pretty tough test. Often you'll get differences when you bring them straight out of storage that don't hold up. In the blue, you can see untreated fruit from control trees, Harvista, Retain, NAA, Retain, and NAA. You can see here, Harvista, in this particular case, had a very marked effect on maintaining firmness. Retain was a little better than control. NAA was worse than control, and the Retain and NAA had some sort of an intermediate effect between Retain and NAA. And in all cases, you see that 1-MCP does a good job of maintaining that firmness after when it's being applied straight after harvest. Here's the downside that we sometimes see. And this shows, for example, how Retain in the blue and Harvista in the blue can make the fruit risk of external CO2 injury higher. And then this is, of course, enhanced with 1-MCP, regardless of your pre-harvest treatment. And the bottom line is that any PGR that delays maturation maintains firmness as we would expect, but can enhance the risk of carbon dioxide injuries. The reason that this is not an issue for us in New York is that we routinely use diphenylamine, the antioxidant that was developed for superficial scald prevention, but it's also incredibly effective at preventing carbon dioxide injuries. So the issue is going to be if you stop using DPA or if regulations stop you using DPA in the future, we're going to have to be very careful about how we manage the storage management to prevent these losses. Right now we're using DPA, so we don't have a care in the world, so to speak. I want to move on to Honeycrisp briefly. Retain and Harvista work over a few seasons. it's clear to us that bitter pit, internal carbon dioxide, and leather blotch risk are sometimes enhanced, but is not always consistent. Keith also mentioned that soft skull can be inhibited by Harvista. We never see that effect when fruit has been stored at 33, but we certainly see that effect if the fruit is stored at temperatures closer to 33 degrees. Sorry, we never see that problem at 38. We do see that problem at 33, but that's not a recommended storage temperature. Just to illustrate how sometimes data can be annoying because it doesn't always give you consistent results year after year. This is work from some years ago of a regional trial in the Hudson Valley, Western New York, and Champlain. And you can see in the case of Hudson Valley that we had a slight decrease in the amount of bitter pit with retain, but in Western New York, the more typical response that we see was shown, and that is a doubling of the amount of bitter pit when you've used either Harvista or you've used retain. Champlain, interestingly enough, where we often see very little bitter pit, we actually got a significant increase of 1.6% carbon dioxide injury versus none, but of course that's absolutely meaningless amount of bitter pit. Some other data that I want to share with you was a trial that we did a couple of years ago, looking at bitter pit in a number of Harvista treatments. And this shows clearly two aspects of the effect of 1 MCP on bitter pit. Number one, if you apply Harvista or pre-harvest 1 MCP in the field, we typically, but as I just showed you, get an increase, in this case from 16% to 29%. And this is consistent with inhibiting the maturation process, and that results typically in a high bitter pit risk. However, if we apply post-harvest 1 MCP, a typical response, again, not always consistent, is to decrease the amount of bitter pit, because everything that you can do after harvest to slow down the rate of metabolism will typically reduce the amount of bitter pit that you see after storage. So the take-home messages for Honeycrisp bitter pit is that we get mixed results, but more often we get either no effect of plant growth regulators or a stimulation of bitter pit with plant growth regulators, because the expectation would be that less mature fruit would be more susceptible. This is a reason, and I was glad that Terence already mentioned it, while we are thinking that the use of PGRs is not something that we would want to advocate on those blocks that have high bitter pit risk. And we will talk a bit more about that next week at the Honeycrisp protection meeting. I also want to highlight, however, that both plant growth regulators, Harvista and retain, can have, as I showed you with McIntosh, a very marked stimulation of the risk of that fruit to carbon dioxide injury. This is the fruit that was from a Western New York trial, treated either with Harvista or retain, stored in 3% oxygen, 3% CO2 at 38 degrees Fahrenheit after conditioning. After 6 months, you can see quite clearly the very marked increase in carbon dioxide injury. That too is manageable. I already mentioned it's manageable if you're using diphenhydramine. So if you're applying diphenhydramine, it's the easy sleep well post-harvest method. Alternatives are to delay the application of controlled atmosphere storage for 4 to 5 weeks. With any other apple than Honeycrisp, we would say that was a no-no, but with Honeycrisp, you don't have a loss of quality of any great extent. The alternative is to maintain very low levels of CO2 in the storage, especially during the first month. So I want to finish off with some comments about Gala. because Glaler is an apple that we have spent a lot of time in the last several years, especially in relation to the stem end flesh browning. That is a disorder that is occurring in South America, in Europe, Washington State, and as well as in New York. So these are 3 separate years. I just want to briefly review the first 2 years where we focused on Harvista, and then this last season where we have some data for Retain and Harvista. So in the first year, we worked with the Fulford strain. We applied Harvista at 60 grams an acre on August 29th, and the fruit were harvested on September 10th and 17th. They were stored with and without post-harvest 1-MCP, and we used either 0.5% oxygen or 2% oxygen. And some of you will be aware that there's increasing use of very low oxygen with Glaler, and you'll see the reason why in a moment. So looking first at the at harvest data, that's not AR data, you'll see at harvest 1, a benefit of Harvista, a slowing down of the starch pattern index, 6.3 versus 4.3 with the Harvista. By the second harvest, there was a general loss of firmness, but still a benefit of Harvista, and a decrease in this is a 2-unit difference in starch. Even though I'm very skeptical of the real value of starch, I have to admit that this is a 2-unit difference compared with a 1-unit difference. And then you've already heard mentioned a couple of times the IAD value, which measures the green color. And here you see the case of Harvista higher than the control at both harvest dates. What does this mean in terms of the susceptibility of fruit to stem end flesh browning? You see a pretty remarkable effect at both harvest dates. The treatment with Harvista, which is in the yellow, and the blue without and with 1-MCP is much greater than the controls at both harvest dates. Just a comment on firmness. The reason I selected this slide was to contrast the effect of harvest date on the effect of Harvista on firmness. So looking at the left-hand side, this light blue is the control. The orange is the control with 1-MCP. So here we see this fairly typical response of the fruit to 1-MCP. However, at the first harvest, you're wasting your money applying 1-MCP because the effect of Harvista was so incredibly strong. However, a week later, you can see how the fruit, the control fruit, has softened markedly over that time. The 1-MCP, post-harvest 1-MCP, whoops, the 1-MCP effect of that fruit was very good, but you'll see that you've lost the benefit of Harvista over that week period, although a very strong response to post-harvest. In the experiment, the second experiment that I want to share with you, it was a number of different rates and concentrations that we used. And the take-home message here is twofold. We look first at the left, the standard early, which is the 1 week, 2 weeks before treatment, and the repeat where Harvista was treated both 1 week and 2 weeks before harvest. You can see a very, very strong reduction on stem end flesh browning and almost no effect or very, very little effect relative when we compare the standard late, that's 1 week before treatment. Unfortunately, we did not have the opportunity to go back and repeat this data, but you can see that there's potential for very important harvest timing in terms of stem end flesh browning. On the right-hand side, I just want to highlight for you For those of you that are storage operators or are farmers that supply storage operators, you'll know there's quite a buzz over the benefit of low oxygen storage and the benefit of low oxygen storage over the pre-harvest treatments is pretty major. The last scale experiment that I want to touch on is with the Brookfield strain, which we know is less sensitive to stem and flesh browning, but nevertheless, we had a trial where the grower applied retain at half rate 3 weeks before harvest, 2/3 rate 3 weeks before harvest, and then we had a 60-gram rate 7 days before harvest. These fruit were harvested twice, plus or minus MCP, stored in normal CA. The take-home messages here are, here I've just combined a number of the harvest dates, but the bottom line is that the retain, at the both rates and the harvester gave us some alleviation of the stem and flesh browning. Perhaps we should have kept this fruit in storage for longer than 6 months to get higher amounts, but nevertheless pretty impressive. And again, with 1 MCP, there actually was not an effect. And we have an interesting set of retain combinations that are being carried out in 2020. So we're really looking forward to seeing those results. So the take-home messages are that harvester and retain can reduce stem and flesh browning. Overall, I believe the effects are probably less than your selection of strain and harvest date management and storage regime that you use for the specific harvest baler blocks. My preference is to use PGRs to get better storage quality at normal harvest rather than extend the harvest season. So I understand the need or the desire to use PGRs to delay harvest, but increase size. That graph by Terence is very impressive, at 1 gram per day. But however, from a post-harvest perspective, we're always worried about the consequence of that. So I'm giving you the post-harvest guy opinion rather than the field guy opinion. And I know that you guys will do whatever you want to do anyway. So in conclusion, the take-home message is what you do in the field also impacts storability of fruit. So it's not just about quality at the time of harvest. We typically see positive effects on condition factors such as firmness, but we know less about the impacts on disorders than ideal. But we have to be aware of the enhanced risks of bitter pit and carbon dioxide injury. And just to plead that if you store at joint storages, co-ops, etc., make sure that you're providing information to the storage operator at the time of delivery. Just to finish off with acknowledgements, Joseph Al-Shafi, who's leads my lab at the moment, Jackie Knock, who you know very well, Fran Dorflinger, the many grower cooperators, the team. This is in the Vanderwalls last season, and the funders, the New York Apple R&D program, who without their support, we could not do this work. AgriFresh for their funding of the second year experiments and federal multi-state project. And I put in here, but somehow it fell out with the New York Farm Viability Institute. So I'll stop there and open up for any questions if there are any.
All right, great. Thank you, Chris. We do have a question here, and if anybody else has them, please type them in. Chris, what are the recommendations for SmartFresh on Snapdragon? And a follow-up, will we be potentially increasing internal browning if we use it?
Yes, no, and yes. So we will be having a New York 1, New York 2 video session. The take-home message from that is that usually Smart Fresh is a big mistake for, sorry, 1-MCP is a big mistake for New York 1, and we don't recommend it. But those of you that were at the storage workshop last year know that that was a very controversial view, but I have data that I will be presenting either next week or the week after that I think you will find convincing that certainly if you're doing long-term storage, the risk of increasing the flesh browning is very high.